They forbade human warships until humanity changed the rules. Part 1, The Decree. The Great Hall of the Galactic Conclave had 7 walls, and each one had been built from stone pulled from a different world. The Velthari had donated pale blue crystal from their frozen moons. The Dran had shipped in slabs of deep red rock from their volcanic homeworld. Even the Sorvex, who rarely agreed on anything at all, had given a wall of shimmering black obsidian that caught the light and scattered it in all directions. But today, none of those walls felt welcoming. Commander Elise Rains stood at the center of the floor and looked up at the 7 delegate platforms arranged in a wide arc above her. She was a tall woman with short dark hair and calm brown eyes, and she had been in difficult rooms before. But this room carried a different kind of weight. This room had the power to change everything. The conclave speaker, a Velthari elder named Sova Keln, rose from his seat and pressed his long, 3-fingered hand flat against the podium in front of him. "The vote has been taken," Sova Keln said in the common tongue, his voice slow and careful. "The result is 7 in favor, 1 opposed. The disarmament directive passes into conclave law as of this session." The hall filled with sound, clicking, humming, low vibrating tones from 7 different species all reacting at once. Rains did not move. She kept her eyes on Sova Keln and waited until the noise settled. "Commander Rains," the speaker continued, "Earth has been heard. Yes, the conclave has made its decision. Then let the record show that Earth opposes this directive in full," Rains said. Her voice was even, not broken, not raised, just even. "Let the record show that humanity came to this conclave as a partner and was treated as a threat." The Dran delegate, a massive 4-armed being named Vorak Sen, leaned forward from his platform with an expression that carried no warmth at all. "Humanity is a threat," he said flatly. 3 border conflicts in 40 years. No other species in this hall has caused so much disruption in so little time. "We resolved all 3 of those conflicts," Rains said. "After starting them," Voraksen replied. Rains looked at the 7 faces looking down at her and understood with complete clarity that nothing she said today was going to change the outcome. And the vote was finished. The directive was now law. Under its exact terms, Earth was forbidden from building, registering, or operating any vessel classified as a warship. All existing human warships had to be decommissioned within 1 standard galactic year, with official conclave observers present at every step to confirm the process was real. She gave a short, respectful bow, not because she agreed, but because she understood how the game was played, and walked out of the hall without another word. Back on Earth, the news spread like fire through dry grass. Some people were furious beyond words. Protests gathered in a dozen cities within hours. Signs went up outside government buildings. Voices rose sharp and angry on every channel. And crowds demanded to know how a collection of alien species had the legal authority to decide what Earth could build on its own soil in its own shipyards with its own materials. The government's public response was careful and calm. Earth would comply. Earth respected the conclave's authority and the rule of law. The decommissioning process would begin immediately, and conclave observers were invited to watch every single step. Behind closed doors, the conversations were completely different. In a long underground room beneath the New Geneva Space Authority building, a group of engineers, lawyers, and senior government officials sat around a wide table covered in documents and half-empty cups. The meeting had already been running for 6 hours. 2 of the lawyers had taken their jackets off. One of the engineers had fallen asleep in his chair and been quietly woken up twice. At the far end of the table sat a man named Garrett Cole. He was not a general or a politician. He was a ship designer, one of the best alive, with short brown hair going gray at the temples and ink-stained fingers that never seemed to come completely clean no matter how hard he scrubbed them. He had 3 tablets open in front of him, and had barely spoken in the last 2 hours. He was reading, thinking, reading again, and thinking harder. When the lead legal advisor, a sharp and tireless woman named Dr. Hera Osei, finally finished her long, careful review of the directive's exact wording, she set her notes down flat and looked around the table. "So," she said, "is there anything in this document we can work with?" The room was quiet. Garrett looked up from his tablets. "The directive bans warships," he said. "Yes," Osei replied, watching him. "It defines a warship as any vessel built, designated, or registered for military combat operations," he continued. "Also, yes," she said. "So what happens," Garrett said, leaning forward just slightly, "if we build something that is none of those things?" The room stayed quiet, but the quality of the quiet was different now. It had changed into something charged. Garrett turned one of his tablets around so the others could see the screen. On it was the early frame of a blueprint, wide body, heavy hull, deep internal bays, engine mounts that any military engineer would recognize immediately, but labeled at the top with nothing more interesting than deep-range freight platform. Civilian class. "We comply completely," he said. "We let the observers watch every warship get taken apart. We follow every word of the directive to the letter, and while we are doing that, we build something else entirely." Dr. Osei picked up the tablet and studied the blueprint for a long, silent moment. "The hull material," she said. "Legal for civilian construction," Garrett replied. "The engine rating falls within long-range exploration drive standards. The internal bays are listed as cargo holds," he said. "Standard freight layout. Nothing in the directive says a cargo hold cannot be reinforced." Osei set the tablet down very carefully. She pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at Garrett with an expression that sat right between admiration and complete disbelief. "This will take years," she said. Yes," Garrett replied. "Every department will need to work quietly and carefully the entire time." "Yes, and if the conclave figures out what we are doing before it is ready, then we had better be ready before they figure it out," Garrett said. Commander Rains had not spoken since she sat down. She had listened to everything, every argument, every legal point, every word out of Garrett's mouth. Now she leaned forward, looked at the blueprint one more time, and picked up her pen. "How many ships?" she asked. Garrett pulled up a second screen, a long list of vessel types, each named after something completely unremarkable. Freight carriers, science platforms, medical response ships, deep exploration vessels, colony support craft. 200, he said. More if the timeline holds." Rains was quiet for a moment, just a moment. Then she nodded once, slow and certain. "Build them," she said. Outside the building, the city moved through the night the way it always did. Ships rose toward orbital stations. News channels played on screens in shop windows. Somewhere across the city, a protest crowd was still chanting, still loud, still angry about what the conclave had done. They were not wrong to be angry, but they did not know yet that the fight had already begun, quietly, carefully, and with no name that any conclave observer would ever flag. In that underground room, Garrett Cole unrolled his blueprints across the full length of the table and got to work. The conclave had drawn a line. Humanity had simply decided to build on the other side of it, and they forbade human warships until humanity changed the rules. Part 2. The storm they did not expect, nobody saw the Vorkai coming. That was the most frightening part, not the attack itself, not the scale of it, not even the speed at which it spread. The most frightening part was that a force that large had moved that quietly through conclave-watched space without a single early warning sensor picking up the pattern. The first strike hit the Outer Rim station of Delvara 9 on a Tuesday by Earth's calendar. The station had housed 4,000 civilians from 3 different species: researchers, traders, families, and a small crew of port workers who had lived there for decades. By the time the Conclave's nearest patrol ship arrived, Delvara 9 was gone. Not damaged, not captured, gone. Nothing remained but a wide field of cooling debris drifting slowly through the dark. The patrol ship captain, a Velthari officer named Commander Tay Voss, sent her report back to Conclave Command in a voice that was completely flat, because flat was all she had left after seeing it. "There is nothing here," she said. "Whatever they used it completely." Within 72 hours, the Vorkai had hit 4 more stations. Then they hit a colony. Then they hit 2 more. The Conclave war fleet mobilized with speed. They were not slow, and they were not disorganized, and every species in the Alliance had powerful ships with powerful weapons. But the Vorkai had clearly been watching the Conclave's formations for a long time. Every time the fleet moved left, the Vorkai had already gone right. Every time a defensive line was set up, the Vorkai came from the direction that left it most exposed. The battles were brutal and short, and the Conclave fleet was losing them. Vorak Sen, the Dran delegate who had spoken so sharply against humanity in the directive hearing, stood before an emergency session of the Conclave 11 days into the campaign. He was not sharp now. He was exhausted, and his 4 large hands gripped the podium so hard his knuckles had gone pale. "We have lost 47 ships in 11 days, he said. "The Vorkai advance is not slowing. Our formations were built to fight threats we knew. These tactics, the angles, the timing, nothing in our recorded doctrine matches what they are doing." The Sorvex delegate, a small gray-skinned creature named Even Doss, raised a hand from her platform. "There is a possibility we have not yet addressed in formal session," she said carefully. "If humanity's fleet were operational—" The room erupted. Voices came from every platform at once, some angry, some desperate, some just loud. Sova Keln struck the podium 3 times with his hand before the noise settled enough for him to speak. "The directive is law," he said. "The directive may cost us the war," Even Doss replied, and she said it simply, without drama, because it did not need drama. The numbers said it for her. A hard silence followed. Then Vorak Sen, the same delegate who had pushed hardest for the directive to pass, looked down at his own hands for a long moment. "If we issue a temporary operational exemption to Earth," he said slowly, "and request that their warships—" "Their warships no longer exist," said a new voice. It came from the side entrance of the hall, where Commander Elise Rains had just walked in, uninvited but unchallenged, because a commander who had just crossed 6 sectors in emergency transit had a certain energy that made people get out of the way. "They were decommissioned," Rains said, walking to the center floor with the same steady pace she always kept. "Every one of them, right in front of your observers, exactly as the directive required." The silence in the hall got heavier. Vorak Sen stared down at her. "Then Earth cannot help us." "That is not what I said," Rains replied. Then the Vorkai broadcast came through. It cracked across every frequency simultaneously. Conclave channels, civilian bands, everything. And it was clearly designed to be heard by as many species as possible. The voice behind it was deep and rough, and carried the particular tone of something that had been winning for so long it had forgotten what losing felt like. "We watched you chain your dogs," the Vorkai commander said. "We watched you make them sit. We watched you take their teeth away and write it into your laws. We waited until it was done, and now there is nothing left to fear." The hall was completely silent after the broadcast cut off. Every delegate on every platform sat without moving. Then Sova Keln looked down at Rains and asked the question the whole conclave was thinking. "Commander, is there anything Earth can do?" Rains looked up at him. She looked at every platform in turn. Dran, Velthari, Sorvex, saw all 7 species. And she let the silence stretch for just a moment longer than was comfortable. "Yes," she said. "Your warships are decommissioned," Vorak Sen started. "We didn't comply," Rains said. The hall went loud again, instantly, sharply, with the particular sound of outrage from 7 species who all had different ways of expressing it, but were all expressing the same thing. Sova Keln's voice cut through the noise. "Commander Rains, the directive was clear. Your decommissioning was observed and confirmed. If Earth violated nothing," Rains said, and her voice was still completely calm. "Pull up the directive. Read it again. Every word, every definition, every clause. We followed all of it. Then how—" Sova Keln began. "Because the directive told us what we could not build," Rains said. It said nothing about what we could." Another silence. But this one was different from all the others. This one had a shape to it. This one felt like the moment just before something very large and very heavy hit the floor. Even Doss leaned forward from her platform. Of all the delegates in the room, she had always been the quietest and the most careful, and it was her voice that asked the question that nobody else had yet managed to form into words. "Commander Rains," she said slowly, "what did you build?" Rains reached into her jacket and pulled out a single data chip. She held it up so the whole chamber could see it, then set it on the reading platform at the center of the floor. "Everything," she said. Outside the conclave hall, in the orbital lanes above the diplomatic station, something was already moving. Longshapes were rising out of jump space one by one, their running lights set to civilian yellow, their transponders broadcasting peaceful freight and science classifications, 200 vessels of every size and configuration, arranged in no formation that any military doctrine had ever named, moving with a calm and quiet purpose that somehow made them look more dangerous than a war fleet ever had. Garrett Cole sat at his station aboard one of the so-called science ships and watched the sensor readouts fill with the shapes of Vorkai vessels 2 sectors ahead. He had spent years designing every bolt of every hull in this fleet. He knew exactly what they could do. He allowed himself one small, quiet smile. And then he got back to work. They forbade human warships until humanity changed the rules. Part 3. The Loophole. The data chip sat on the reading platform at the center of the conclave floor, and for a long moment nobody moved toward it. Then Sova Keln descended from the speaker's platform, which he had never done in a live session, not once in his 12 years as speaker, and walked to the center of the floor himself. He picked up the chip, turned it over in his long, pale fingers, and slid it into the nearest console, the main display above the chamber filled with numbers, names, and blueprints. 214 vessel entries, everyone listed under civilian classification, freight carriers with hull plating 3 times the standard thickness, science platforms with engine cores that could push them to military sprint speeds, and medical response ships with internal bays that were labeled emergency equipment storage in font so plain it almost hurt to look at. The hall was quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. Not the quiet of respect or patience, the quiet of 7 species trying very hard to understand what they were looking at. Voraxen was the first one to find his voice. "These are warships," he said. "No," said Dr. Hara Ose, stepping forward from the human delegation bench, where she had been sitting in silence since Rains walked in. She was carrying a document folder so thick it looked like a small building, and she set it on the reading platform next to the console with a sound like a door slamming. "They are not, and I have 400 pages explaining exactly why they are not." The conclave's own legal scholar, as a quiet Velthari named Pora Sen, rose from his advisory seat and crossed the floor to look at the display. He moved slowly, reading line after line, his long fingers tracing vessel specifications with careful attention. The rest of the hall watched him and waited. Nobody spoke while Pora Sen read. It took 11 minutes. When he turned around, his expression was something that could not easily be named. Not anger, not admiration, something directly in between that had no clean word in any known language. "The hull materials," he said to Osei. "Permissible under civilian deep-range construction standards," she replied immediately, as if she had been waiting for exactly that sentence. "The engine cores, listed under long-haul exploration drive specifications, which have no military designation under directive language. The internal configurations, cargo holds, and equipment bays," Osei said. "Every single one, reinforced, yes, because civilian ships operating in deep space require structural integrity against asteroid impacts, pressure events, and emergency scenarios. The directive contains no restriction on civilian hull reinforcement." "The weapon systems," Porasen started. "There are no weapon systems," Osei said. Voraxen's voice came down from his platform like a stone dropped from a great height. "That is not possible. Those vessels cannot operate in combat without—" "Each vessel carries an emergency defense module," Osei said, opening her folder to a specific page and holding it up. "Installed under Conclave Code 17, subsection 4, which grants all civilian vessels the right to carry proportional defensive capability against piracy and deep space threats. This right was written into Conclave law before humanity ever joined the Alliance, and it was never removed or restricted by the Disarmament Directive because the directive only addressed warships, and these are not warships." The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Porasen looked at the folder, then at the display, then at Osei. "The emergency defense modules," he said very carefully. "Are they proportional?" Osei held his gaze without blinking. "They meet every definition in the existing code. And if those modules were all active simultaneously across 214 vessels, that would be a question of tactics," Osei replied. "Hi, not classification!" Porasen turned to face the full chamber. Every delegate was leaning forward. He spread his hands in the formal Velthari gesture of legal confirmation, the one that meant he had checked and could not find a flaw. "I cannot fault the classification," he said. "Under the exact language of the Disarmament Directive, these vessels are not warships. Earth has not violated the directive." The Dran platform erupted. The Velthari delegates were arguing between themselves in fast, sharp tones. Even the usually calm Sorvex were shifting in their seats with visible agitation. Then Fleet Admiral Mei Chen walked into the hall. She had been waiting outside the chamber with the human military delegation, and Rains had sent the signal for her to enter at exactly this moment, when the outrage was loudest and the shock was freshest. Chen was a compact woman with iron-gray hair cut close to her head, and she moved to the center floor with the energy of someone who had absolutely nowhere else to be and all the time in the world to be there. She waited for the noise to reduce to a level where her voice could carry clearly. Then she spoke. "7 years ago," she began, "this conclave decided that humanity was too dangerous to be trusted with warships. You decided that our history was too short, that our conflicts were too frequent, and that the galaxy would be safer if Earth was limited in what it could build." She looked up at every platform in turn. "We heard you. We went home. We followed the law. Every word, every clause, and every requirement." She paused. "You told us we could not build warships, so we built something better. Ships that were never warships. Crewed by people who were never soldiers, doing a job that was never called war." Vorak Sen's voice came down hard. "This is deception, pure and deliberate deception." "This is engineering," Chen replied. "And if this conclave had trusted humanity enough to sit at the defense table as an equal partner instead of chaining us to the floor, we would not have needed to be clever about it." The hall was loud again, but underneath the noise, something had shifted. Because the Vorkai were still out there and 47 conclave ships were still gone, and every delegate in that room understood that the 214 vessels now visible on the display screen represented the only fresh combat-capable force within striking range. Even Doss raised her hand from the Sorvex platform. "Speaker," she said, "I recommend the conclave table the classification debate and address the immediate operational question." Sovakeln looked at the display for a long moment. He looked at Rains, then at Chen, then at the 400 pages of legal documentation sitting on the reading platform. He pressed his hand flat against the podium. "Commander Rains," he said, "Fleet Admiral Chen, can your civilian fleet engage the Vorkai?" Chen looked at Rains. Rains looked at Chen. They both looked up at Sovakeln. "We already are," Rains said. And across 2 sectors of space, and the ships that were never warships, crewed by people who were never soldiers, began to move. They forbade human warships until humanity changed the rules. Part 4. Dogs off the leash. The Vorkai battle group that controlled the Kasara transit corridor had 26 ships. They had taken the corridor 11 days ago, and they held it the way a creature holds something it is not planning to give back, with weight and stillness and the quiet confidence of something that has no reason to move. Their flagship, a long, dark vessel the Conclave intelligence teams had named the Crusher-class Dreadnought, sat at the center of the formation like a fist held just above a table. The Vorkai sensor officer on duty when the human fleet arrived did not immediately call for battle stations. He called for the communications officer instead. Because the sensor readout was showing 214 contacts, and not a single one of them was carrying a military transponder. They were broadcasting civilian codes, freight identifiers, scientific survey markers, medical response flags. The formation pattern was not a formation at all. It looked like a traffic jam, honestly, like someone had told 200 vessels to show up in the same sector at the same time, and nobody had bothered to sort them into lines. The sensor officer stared at his screen for a full 15 seconds. Then he decided someone higher up needed to see this and called his commanding officer. The Vorkai fleet commander, a broad-shouldered being named Grath Vo, stood over the sensor display and looked at the same traffic jam picture and felt, for the first time since this campaign began, something that was not quite confidence. "Civilian registry," his weapons officer confirmed. "No weapon signatures detected, no military drive output, 214 contacts all broadcasting non-combat identification." "Then what are they doing here?" Grathvo asked. Nobody answered because nobody knew. One of his advisors leaned in and spoke quietly. "Perhaps Earth sent them for a different reason, a show of presence, a protest action." 200 ships is not a protest," Grathvo said. He stared at the display a moment longer. Then he made the decision that every analyst looking back at this battle would later call the most expensive mistake in Vorkai military history. "They are civilians," he said. "Let them get close. When they are in full range, broadcast the standard warning and give them 10 seconds to turn back. If they do not turn back, we disable their lead vessels and send the rest running." The weapons officer nodded and opened the broadcast channel. He never got to send the warning, because Garrett Cole, sitting at his power routing station aboard the deep-range science platform Horizon 7, which was the 3rd ship in the 2nd wave of the human formation, had been watching the Vorkai formation on passive sensors for 40 minutes and had already run the numbers 6 times. He pressed one key. The signal went out across the entire human fleet simultaneously. 214 emergency defense modules came online at the same moment, and the energy bloom on the Vorkai sensors was so sudden and so large that 3 of their bridge officers flinched backward from their stations. Grathvo grabbed the edge of his command console and stared at the display as the picture changed completely. Every one of those civilian ships lighting up with output signatures that his targeting computers were struggling to categorize because they had no category for this. "Battle stations!" he shouted. But the human fleet was already moving. This was the thing that the Vorkai had not counted on, and could not have counted on, because it had never happened before. The human fleet did not move like a war fleet. It did not form lines or wedges or any of the organized shapes that every space force in the known galaxy used, because organized shapes were efficient, and efficient was what military training produced. The human fleet moved like a freight network that had suddenly gone insane, because that was exactly what Garrett had designed it to do. He had not designed these ships with military tacticians. He had designed them with freight logistics engineers, people who spent their careers moving large numbers of vessels through crowded lanes as fast as possible without hitting each other. The approach patterns, the gap calculations, the timing, all of it came from a completely different world of thinking than the Vorkai's military doctrine had ever encountered. The medical ship on the outer edge peeled left and drew 3 Vorkai escorts after it. As soon as the escorts committed to that direction, 2 freight carriers that had been running dark came in from above and hit them from an angle no combat tactician would have used, because a combat tactician would have considered it wasteful. It was not wasteful, it was fast. A science platform targeted the Vorkai sensor array with a focused pulse from its emergency defense module. The pulse was technically within the legal definition of a defensive measure designed to reduce threat detection capability. The Vorkai sensor officer did not think it felt defensive. He thought it felt like getting hit in the face. Grathvo's flagship directed its main guns at the nearest human vessel, which happened to be a colony support craft that was broadcasting a humanitarian assistance code on a loop, and fired. The shot hit the hull. The hull, which Garrett had built from the same alloy used in destroyer-class warships, because civilian ships in deep space needed structural integrity and there was no rule against it, absorbed the strike with damage that would have destroyed a standard civilian vessel completely, and instead produced a hull breach in one cargo section and a very loud alarm. The crew sealed the breach in 4 minutes. Then they fired back. The colony support craft's emergency defense module produced an output that Grathvo's weapons officer described in his official report later as disproportionate for a vessel of that classification, though he did not include in the report how loudly he had said it or how fast he had said it. The Vorkai flagship rolled hard to avoid the second shot. It did not avoid it. Across the full engagement zone, the Conclave Allied ships that had been holding position at the edge of sensor range were watching the battle on their displays and saying very little. The Sorvex captain of the Conclave vessel, Quiet Star, a small being named Faravos, had not blinked in 6 minutes. The human fleet was not fighting the way anyone fought. It was fighting the way a storm fought, everywhere from every direction, and with no respect for the formations that 200 years of galactic military doctrine had established as the correct and sensible way to do things. "Are those medical ships?" her first officer asked quietly. "They were medical ships," Faravos replied. Garrett rerouted power from the secondary science lab array to the defensive module charge cycle and watched his timing estimates scroll across his screen. His hands moved fast across the console, because he had designed this specific routing sequence and knew exactly where the bottlenecks were and exactly how to push past them. The ship shuddered as a Vorkai escort put a shot across their bow. "Returning the favor," said the ship's captain, a steady-voiced woman named Lisa Tran, and she said it with the particular calm of someone who had spent 12 years flying freight through asteroid belts and considered a Vorkai escort to be a manageable inconvenience. 3 hours after the engagement began, Grathvo gave the order to fall back. He gave it quietly, with no drama, because there was no version of what had just happened that he could frame as anything other than what it was. The Vorkai fleet pulled away from the Kassara corridor in good order. They were still disciplined, they were still intact enough to move. But they left the corridor behind them, and they left 12 ships in pieces across the sector, and they left behind something harder to measure but impossible to miss. They left behind the understanding that they had made a mistake. The human fleet held the corridor. Some 214 ships that were never warships, crewed by people who were never soldiers, sat across the Kesara transit lane and broadcast their civilian transponder codes into the silence and waited to see what came next. Garrett set his tablet down and pressed his back against his chair and looked at the ceiling of his station for a long moment. Then he pulled up his design files and started making notes. Because there were things that had worked better than expected and things that had worked worse, and he was going to know the difference before anyone asked. They forbade human warships until humanity changed the rules. Part 5. New Rules. The Vorkai did not come back to the Kesara corridor. They tried 3 other positions over the following week, 2 conclave supply routes and an outer colony cluster, and each time the human fleet was already there, moving through space in its disorganized, illogical, completely infuriating way. The Vorkai commanders tried new angles and new timing and new formations, and none of it worked the way it was supposed to because the thing they were fighting had not come from military doctrine and did not follow military logic and refused to stand in the place that their targeting calculations expected it to be. By the end of the 2nd week, the Vorkai advance had stopped. By the end of the 3rd week, it had reversed. By the end of the month, the Vorkai broadcast a new message across the same frequencies they had used for their first one, the one about chained dogs. This message was shorter. It said that the Vorkai were withdrawing to their own space pending a diplomatic review of the campaign's objectives. It was a careful and formal way of saying something that could be said in far fewer words. The war was over. The Conclave called its Reformation session 12 days after the last Vorkai vessel crossed back into disputed territory. It was the most attended session in the Hall's history. Every species had sent not just their delegates, but their senior legal teams, their military advisors, and in 3 cases their heads of government. The viewing galleries were full. The press platforms were overflowing. The air in the hall had the particular electric quality of a moment that everyone in it understood was going to be remembered. Commander Elise Rains walked in last. She walked to the center floor the way she always did, steady, unhurried, with exactly the expression she chose to wear, and she stood there and looked up at the 7 platforms and waited. Sovakeln was already standing at his podium. "This session has 2 items of formal business," he said. "The first is the status of the disarmament directive. The second is the future structure of conclave defense policy." Vorak Sen spoke first, which surprised nobody. He was still one of the loudest voices in the hall, but today the sharpness in his tone was different. It was not the sharpness of someone who was winning. It was the sharpness of someone working very hard to stay dignified while losing. "The disarmament directive was violated in spirit," he said. "Even if the legal scholars cannot find a technical breach, need any reasonable interpretation of the directive's intent." "Directives are not governed by intent," Dr. Osei said from the human legal bench, with a patience that had been honed over months of preparation for exactly this moment. "They are governed by language. The conclave chose the language. Earth followed it. A new directive should be drawn up immediately to close the loophole." Vorak Sen pressed. "We have a counter-proposal," Rains said. The hall went quiet. Rains stepped forward and placed a second document folder on the reading platform. It was thinner than Dr. Osei's legal defense folder, just 20 pages, but it carried a weight that had nothing to do with paper. "Humanity does not want to operate outside conclave law," Rains said. "We never did. We were pushed outside it by a directive that treated us as a problem instead of a partner." She looked up at every platform in the arc above her. "We are asking for something different now. We are asking for a seat at the defense table, a real seat, not an observer post, a defense council within the conclave with equal representation, equal authority, and a human chair for the first founding term." The noise that followed was immediate and strong, but Rains waded through it because she had waded through noise before and she was very good at it. It was even Doss who brought the hall back to order. not Sova Keln, not by formal procedure, but simply by standing and raising her hand in the Sorvex gesture, for I wish to speak, and I will not sit down until you let me. The Sorvex delegation will support this proposal, she said, and when the room had quieted enough to hear her. We have watched humanity operate in this crisis, and we have watched ourselves operate, and we are clear on which performance we would rather have defending our colonies. A long silence followed. Then the Velthari senior delegate, not Sova Keln, but the political delegate beside him, a quiet elder named Tova Len, who had not spoken once in the entire session, leaned forward and said something that the hall had not expected. The Velthari delegation supports the proposal as written. Vorak Sen looked at the Velthari platform, then he looked at the Sorvex platform, then he looked around the full arc of the chamber with the expression of someone doing mathematics in their head. The Dran delegation, he said very slowly, will support the proposal, with an amendment that the Defense Council operate under full conclave oversight. Accepted, Rains said immediately, because she had expected that amendment and it cost her nothing. The vote was not unanimous. 2 of the 7 species entered formal objections that would be logged in the permanent record. But the numbers were 5 in favor, 2 opposed, and the proposal passed. When the session ended and the hall began to empty, Sova Keln descended from his platform for the second time in his years as speaker and crossed the floor to where Rains was standing. He was a tall being, taller than most humans, and he looked down at her for a moment before he spoke. You were patient, he said. Most species in your position would not have been. We had work to do, Rains replied. Fight patient was easier than angry. He was quiet for a moment. We underestimated you. Yes, she said. You did. She said it without heat, without satisfaction, without any edge at all, just as a simple fact, offered cleanly and then let go. He nodded once and turned and walked away. 3 days after the session, Garrett Cole was back on Earth. He was in the same underground room beneath the New Geneva Space Authority building where this had all started, and the table was covered in the same kind of documents and cups it had been covered in before, but the feeling in the room was entirely different now. He sat at the far end of the table with a fresh tablet in his hands and a blank blueprint on the screen. Dr. Osi came in and set a cup next to his elbow and looked at the blank screen. Already? She asked. There are things I want to do differently, he said. Things that worked and things that almost didn't. Some of the power routing under combat load was slower than it should have been. The defense module charge cycles need a redesign. The hull material held, but the seam plating on the midsection ships showed stress points I want to address. Osei looked at the blank blueprint. And the classification? Garrett looked up at her. Then he smiled, a real one, wide and unhurried. He typed 4 words at the top of the screen in large, clear letters. Human Conclave Defense Vessel. And below that, in a classification field that had been empty for years, he typed 1 more word. A warship. He looked at it for a moment, at that single honest word sitting in the field where it was always supposed to be, and then he picked up his pen and started drawing. The galaxy had tried to take humanity's teeth. It had only taught them to build sharper ones.